My name is Richard August, and I'll be your host. Our guest is Minority Leader of the House of Representatives, Mike Chippendale, a Republican from District 40 that covers parts of Coventry, Foster, and Gloucester. He was first elected in 2010. Welcome back to State of the State.
Thank you, Dick. It's great to be here.
Let me first say that my Majority Leader, Christopher Blazejewski, was invited to participate in this discussion. And after first indicating acceptance, he declined to appear because of a scheduling difficulty and conflict. Leader Chippendale, let's start with a controversy, some would say a scandal, concerning the confusing race among Democrats to replace Congressman David Cicilline, who resigned midstream to take the top job at the Rhode Island Foundation. A campaign worker for Lieutenant Governor Sabina Matos, who was an obscure member of the Providence City Council until chosen by Governor Dan McKee for the #2 job when he ascended to the governor's office, apparently forged signatures on the form needed to get on the ballot. The Jamestown Board of Canvassers detected the forgeries, and Channel 12 picked up the story. The person allegedly responsible for the forged signatures appeared in a Matos campaign ad in her race for a full term as lieutenant governor. Now, the East Providence Board of Canvassers noticed forged signatures in that city involving another campaign worker. Matos is now playing the victim and claiming that these two people, who she says, do not represent her campaign. Leader Chippendale, when you returned from vacation, we heard this news that you posted on Facebook that, and I'm quoting, "There was no need for her to commit fraud, but she did," referring to Lieutenant Governor Matos. Care to comment further?
Absolutely. You know, we're at a period in history where elections and the integrity of elections have come into question. I remember the first time in my adult life was in 2000. Right? We had hanging chads and we had other things going on. And it just kept getting worse and worse. And then we had 2016, we had 2020, we had it got to the point where folks have started to say to themselves, my vote doesn't count, why am I going to bother? So when I had first read this story, and I didn't make any assumptions. I just went on the facts, which at the time were much less damning, frankly, than they are now, because it seems to be in multiple towns. Look, in order to get on the ballot, you need to garner a certain number of signatures. It's not hard to do. We all have to do it every single election. Now, why there had to be fraud involved in that? In my opinion, there's no reason. There's absolutely no reason why, particularly somebody who's a sitting lieutenant governor with name recognition, with experience on the council in Providence, could not have very easily gotten the requisite signatures. So what that did, in my opinion, and I feel this very, very strongly, is it validated a lot of the concerns that folks have been expressing about the integrity of elections. If at this stage, one of the easiest parts of an election, simply getting the names to get on the ballot, if it was necessary to cheat at that point, why should people trust the elections that put me and everyone else in elected office in our offices? And the answer is they shouldn't be. They should be suspect. And I think we didn't do ourselves any favors by this happening here. It did not help the state in any way, shape, or form, and I think it hurt us.
You pointed out that Jamestown is a small community, and the Board of Canvassers was very vigilant in doing their checking of these signatures, which is really not likely to happen in Providence, for example, which has obviously many more voters.
Sure, yeah, the smaller towns. I mean, if you come into Foster and you walk into a polling place, as soon as they look at your license and they holler out your name and your address in the room, if you're not who you say you are, there are a lot of people in that room who are going to know that. That's the benefit of a small town. Folks know each other. Folks know who votes, know who doesn't vote, who participates, who doesn't.
Or who moved out of town.
Or who moved out of town, or who died.
Yeah.
Right? And that's how this happened in Jamestown. One of the canvassers, who I understand was a newer canvasser, actually picked up on a person that he knew to be dead, and started to research, well, how could this dead person have signed this? So, again, when you get to the point where you have, and I'm not making any separation between the candidate and the candidate's campaign, because they're one and the same. If you hire a contractor, if you hire an advocate, or if you let an advocate work for you, an activist, they're still yours, and you still bear the blame when something goes down sideways, and in this case, something did. It's not good for the state, it's not good for elections, and it's not good for the people.
It's like hiring a lawyer and then saying he's an attorney, but he doesn't represent me.
Yeah.
So we had Secretary of State Greg Amore on this program when he was a candidate for that office. Off air, after the program, I told him that published reports for the town of North Kingstown show the number of registered voters at about 22,000 in a town with a total population of just under 28,000, which would be an 80% of the residents of the town are registered voters, which is impossible. And when I asked the Board of Canvassers in town about this, they said it's almost impossible to remove someone from the voter roll. And candidate Amore seemed to question my numbers. He said, this kind of information, I mean, you said in your post, this kind of information solidifies the notion that elections can be stolen. Explain that. When you say elections can be stolen, that's pretty...
So when people are asserting, as they have been for the past 4 years, that elections are being stolen, or the past 7 years now, and they're pointing to improprieties either at the polls, in ballot boxes, in mail ballots, what have you, they're pointing to elections. And they're saying, we know that this isn't what happened. And they don't necessarily have any proof to say that this happened, this vote was stolen, these mail ballots. But then when something like this occurs, that whole notion that elections can be stolen. I'm not saying that what happened here stole an election. I'm saying the notion of elections being up for grabs is how can you deny it at that point? If you're going to cheat on something where you can be caught so easily, which is a verification of a signature. Is this Mrs. Smith's signature? Here's her historical signature. No, it's not, or yes, it is. Let's ask Mrs. Smith. No, I didn't sign it. That's easy to verify. But when you vote, once you hand in your ballot, that can never be verified, right? So if people are willing to cheat on the part that can be verified, what about the part that can't be verified? Yeah. That's what's going through voters' heads. And they're asking themselves, and this is something that, particularly as Republicans, we've been working against in the state of Rhode Island, is to tell people, no, you have to continue to vote. You have to come out. You have to participate, because otherwise you give up. You've just rolled over and everything's gone. All of your worst fears have come true. So that notion of election fraud is out there. And then something like this happens, it only validates that in people's minds. There are people who saw this, and now it's solidified in their minds that everything they thought true is now true.
Some people, I think, who haven't filed a mail-in ballot don't realize the ballot itself is not signed. Right. It's the application that's signed, and then, that's supposedly what is checked, but the ballot itself is not signed. Once it's in the box, it's anonymous.
Absolutely.
So, using the COVID pandemic scare, I'll call it, as cover, former Secretary of State Nellie Gorbea, in defiance of state law, in 2016 created a voting season instead of an election day as called for in the Constitution. In that election, one of my sons, who has not lived in or voted in Rhode Island since 1989 when he graduated high school, received a mail ballot from Gorbea's office for that election, in spite of the fact that I had sent 2 notices to the Board of Canvassers that he no longer lived in the state. Now this season, as I suspected, this voting season has been enshrined in state law. Yeah, comment on that? Am I overreacting to this? Or?
No, certainly in 2020 when that happened, I myself, every candidate, every elected official, we all started getting calls from our constituents. I had one of mine call me. He said, look, it's me and my wife. My daughter moved out of here 21 years ago. My son out of here 18 years ago. Neither one of us. So they had 4 children who had left the state. They were out of the state. And they got mail-in ballot applications for them. And he said, Mike, these are my kids. I could have very easily scribbled their names on there, right, and no one would have questioned it. And we would have tripled our voting power in my household, me and my wife, if we got all 4 of our kids. He said, of course we wouldn't do it, but it's possible. And that was really the first phone call I got when these happened. But then it just kept getting more and more and more. Hey, why is my aunt getting an application? She died in 2006, and it came to my house. You know, these were the phone calls we were getting. That was extremely concerning to everyone. I think it was exceptionally reckless, but intentional on Gorbea's part. And I think you may have used this phrase. It was a seizing on the national health crisis and the state of emergency to just soften the way that that elections were. And it did. It stuck. It's enshrined now. You know, the voting season, as you put it, for a while we have had an open mind about the idea of early voting. But early voting, perhaps from the Friday before the election through the weekend, Monday, and then Tuesday, you know? So you have a 5-day or a 6-day election period because not everybody can simply make it to the polls. My daughter's a nurse, and at the time, last election, she was on first shift. She could not be at the polls when they opened. Early voting is safe. If you're doing it in your town hall, you're doing it the same way you'd be doing it at the polls. If you can't make it on election day and you have a few days that allow you to get in there early, that's great. I think that's fine. The no excuse mail ballots, I don't see any legitimate reason for no excuse mail ballots. We used to have to provide a reason. We're infirmed.
You're overseas with the military.
Absolutely. Yeah. And in those cases, I think that it's appropriate. And even my elderly father, he needed help getting mail ballots, so I got the application, I brought it to him, and he mailed it in. You know, it does serve a purpose if folks are homebound or sick or whatever. But the ubiquity of it now is what's got so many people concerned.
Well, it certainly was a great success for some candidates who we know that in the last election, by far the greatest number of ballots were cast before Election Day. And this should be of concern. I mean, some commentators have said that Democrats seem to have mastered this program, so to speak, or this season to a greater extent than the Republicans, who still want to turn out to vote on Election Day. And you're not going to compensate on Election Day if 60%, 70% of the votes have already been cast.
Yeah, you know, and that's just, I think, an inherent value of the types of voters that each of us rely upon. So our Democratic friends, yes, they're able to work the high rises and the apartments and the nursing homes, et cetera, with good success. Folks who are inclined to support a Republican or a conservative in general, they're not inclined to just hand over their ballot to somebody else and trust that it's going to be taken care of. So when, you know, and we always do, we always have, well before this whole thing started in 2020, we would always ask people, if you need a mail-in ballot, let us know. And there's just an aversion among the folks who typically support Republicans because they don't trust that it's going to make it where it needs to be. So maybe they'll ask for help getting the application, but they'll be damned if they're going to let you actually handle any of that paperwork. Yeah. They'll take care of it themselves. So we won't ever get the same number of voters or the same percentage of voters through mail ballots, ever. And that's something that I think Republicans understand. And voters maybe aren't as nuanced on the differences in the thoughts and the process of the voters. But we have to, I think, as Republicans, we have to focus on ensuring folks understand early voting is safe. And if they do need a mail ballot, that we can help facilitate that. We can track it. In other words, we know when they sent in their application, if it was improved, when it was mailed, the ballot was mailed to them. If the ballot has been received back, we can track all that. It's public information. Anyone can track that. So we help our voters who do use that method, but we do realize the most amount of our votes on Election Day. There's no question about that.
One thing that struck me, I worked at a polling place again this last election, and the thing that struck me was that we had to make provision. There was actually a box for people who had applied for a mail ballot. They could bring it to the polling place and throw it in the box, but they couldn't vote on Election Day. It made no sense to me at all.
Yeah, I mean, that's a safeguard. That's a safeguard where a person who's applied for and been granted a mail ballot cannot go into a polling place on Election Day and vote because they're already identified as a mail voter.
Correct. They'll come up on them, yes.
And we had, I think there were 4 instances documented in this past election of people who voted twice, and all 4 of them were accidental And I think they were all for that exact reason. They had requested the mail ballot, and then they voted on election day, and then the mail ballot showed up. It wasn't a widespread thing, but it can happen. But the system stopped it in that case.
Let's look back at some of the bills that passed in the last session and some that didn't. First, the Democrats pretty much passed the budget requested by Governor McKee of nearly $14 billion. This used as a baseline the previous year's budget that was enhanced by over $1 billion of Joe Biden's COVID cash, what I call COVID cash. Mm-hmm. Were Republicans in favor of this budget, and did they try to amend it on the floor?
Not all of the Republicans were in favor of the budget, and to the extent that it was what the governor proposed, size-wise it most certainly was, but the House changed a lot of the proposed policies. Republican amendments did not need to be introduced in the same volume as they have in the past, because I simply had conversations with the Speaker and the leadership of the House ahead of time that we have an amendment that we're going to be introducing. We can drop it on you on the last day, or we can talk about it now. If it's a good fit, we can implement it. We had about almost 24 amendments, ideas that we could have put amendments in on, and nearly all of them were adopted into the budget without a fight.
Through the committee process?
Yeah, just through the process of, there would have to be a hearing on the initiative, of course, and the conversation with what goes in the budget, what goes in, what's not going to go into the budget is something that happens with the majority leader, the minority leader, the Senate, the House Speaker, the finance chair, et cetera, et cetera. And when our proposals were analyzed, they were sound, they were good. They saved the state money. They brought money into the state without costing taxpayers a dime. And they stopped fraud, and it made government operations more efficient. These are all things that you can't possibly say no to. Mm-hmm. So when presented in the way that we did, they were adopted right into the budget that was voted on. So some of us, and I played a hand in obviously crafting those amendments, as did some of my colleagues, and those of us who felt that enough of our amendments had been included supported the budget, and some of my colleagues who didn't feel that it went far enough didn't support it. And I think that's good, and that's the way it should work. Okay. There's this notion that you have to follow the leader, you have to follow the pack. In the Republican caucus, that's not the case. Our members have to represent the 14,000 people in their district the best way that they know how to. If that means they support the budget, then they support the budget. If that means they don't vote for the budget, then they don't vote for the budget. It never gets held against anybody in our caucus. It's just the way that we believe the entire room should work all the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, kudos to Speaker Sicarci and Finance Committee Chairman Abney then for listening to the minority party's suggestions.
Yeah, I was pleased with the interactions we had, and I'm glad that they saw the value in the amendments.
Now, it just occurs to me that Democrats tend not to say that government is spending money. The phrase they like to use is it's investing.
Sure, sure.
So once begun, this of investing in special interest projects, it's almost impossible to turn off. Do you agree? And how do we get government spending under control?
So right now, that's one of those things that's going to really hit the burner in the next session, because as you pointed out, there was this infusion of federal funding, of pandemic money. And then the feds kind of rearranged things a little bit, and that money had to be spent by the end of this fiscal year. So we incorporated all of it into this budget, which is what kept the size so large. That money won't be there next year, Dick. So if we were to attempt to put another $14 billion budget in front of the people, that whole delta where the loss of federal funds is would have to be made up directly from you and me and everybody else in the state who pays taxes. Yeah. That's where my colleagues' ability to cut spending is going to be put to the test. Yeah. Because we just simply won't be able to maintain the level of spending that this budget created. However, in order for us to support, for Republicans to even consider supporting the budget, one of the things that we demanded and was part of this budget was that none of those emergency funds, none of those COVID funds, as you call them, would go into a program that needed to be funded in perpetuity. There would only be one-time expenditures. So they would have to be invested into things such as infrastructure that would help a town, a city, a business. They would have to be invested into programs that were meant to help in one shot and then not live on forever. Otherwise, they would require that. And you would, not only would you have no savings or cuts in spending, you'd have an increase in spending, and you'd have an increase in taxation. Are we going to be able to do that next year? I don't have a crystal ball. I'm optimistic that, based on our conversations so far, that my Democratic colleagues see it the same way that I do in that respect, and that we won't have a budget nearly as large as this one was.
Well, hopefully cooler heads will prevail.
I hope so.
So let's talk about a perennial bill introduced by gun control advocates that did not pass this year, which is the ban on so-called assault weapons, military-style weapons, weapons of war, whatever you choose to call them. Well-funded groups such as Moms Demand Action and the Coalition Against Gun Violence and Providence Nonviolence Institute come out every year in favor of a bill that Governor McKee and Attorney General Noronha both supported. Now, why didn't it pass this year with all this support that seemed to be at the administrative level?
You know, I think there's a couple of good reasons why. First of all, I mean, you had guys like me and some others and some Democrats constantly chirping at the speaker that we can't keep doing this. But also, our argument this year pivoted towards, look at all the money Rhode Island is spending defending lawsuits based on gun legislation that we've passed. Look at all the losses that the state is incurring. And frankly, you're paying the attorney's fees for the prevailing side that is suing the state. It's costing us a lot of money, and we're not making any dent in crime because these bills don't do that. They're not designed to do that. These bills are designed to eliminate private firearm ownership. That is the intent of these groups that are putting this forward, these well-funded groups that you referenced, who are great at marketing and great at coming up with ridiculous, poppycock studies of how many people support this, that, and the other. And I think that the leadership saw that there was, with all the lawsuits right now, particularly with some of the federal cases, and I know that you're very familiar with them, that are lingering out there, and what will the ultimate disposition be with the Supreme Court, they didn't want to jump right back into that fire. Now, that doesn't mean those bills won't be introduced next year. It doesn't mean they won't pass next year. We don't know. Every year, we live 1 year at a time in that building. But this year, there was enough pressure and enough rational, calm. The other side likes to say common sense, gun safety. They use wonderful mishmash of words to soften their messages. But common sense prevailed in this case because we were getting sued and we were losing and we were hurting people with these bills. We weren't stopping criminals. It wasn't the people who disobey the laws who were getting stopped. It was innocent people who didn't realize such a ridiculous law had passed in the previous year, who ended up getting caught and finding themselves in trouble. And then some of them were able to get it off of the charges, et cetera. But it all cost the state money. And their stated goal of making the state safer never materializes. It never does. It hasn't since they started this in 1995 around here. It just won't do it.
The Article 22, Section 1 of our Rhode Island Constitution says simply, the right of the people to own and carry firearms shall not be infringed. Period. Full stop.
Yeah.
Yet every year it seems that this is being chipped that way at, infringed by the Red Flag Law, Safe Schools Act, the High Capacity Magazine ban. Almost seems like a death by 1,000 cuts. But as you're indicating, at least what I hear you saying, I think, is people are in the legislature are beginning to look at this and say, well, what's the effect of these laws? What is it really doing to reduce crime and make us safer?
Absolutely. And we all watch the news and we all read the paper and we all see that, Charlie Brown gets arrested this night with a gun, doing something stupid. And then 2 weeks later, Charlie Brown gets arrested again, stabbing someone in Newport. And then a month later, Charlie Brown gets arrested with a firearm. People start to question, what's going on? Why is this character who's always getting in trouble with guns continuing to get out on the street? And it's been the folks who think the way I do on this issue, it's been our assertion for a very long time that it's a lack of prosecution. It's a lack of being tough. There's this criminal justice reform fad right now that while there is a need for some thoughtful criminal justice reform, they're cutting so deeply now, they just want to let people people off. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing DAs across the country do that. And how many stories a day can you find, on the news of so-and-so was just released without bail, or no cash bail or something, and they do something terrible. People are getting fed up with that. So the narrative that the other side sows about gun safety and blah, 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 it's just not, people don't see, they don't see that materializing. So they're starting to take it with a grain of salt, and that's, I think, healthy.
Now, another bill that did pass that was long sought, I think, by Democrats especially, is passing so-called driving permits for people living here illegally, either because they overstay their visa or come across the border without proper documentation. And the claim is that this will allow these people to come out of the shadows, as they say, and be able to get to work, be able to get doctor's appointments, and make our roads safer. And I was told, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, there was an exchange between Republican, I think it was Patricia Morgan and Judiciary Chairman Bob Craven, in which there was a discussion about whether or not these permits would have a barcode that would enable them to be used as voter identification devices. I'm told that these permits do have a barcode on the back. Do you agree that this represents a potential for these people to be voting if they're not here legally?
Yeah, absolutely it does. The discussion has always been that the prohibitor would be inside the barcode. And there is a barcode on the back, but it does lack the certain voting information that your license or my license has on it. Well, that's only part of the issue. If someone gets themselves registered or is registered to vote, we know that this happens, who shouldn't be, and they walk in with that card. There's no way to distinguish on that card whether or not that it's a DPC, a driver privilege card, or a driver's license. They look the same, and that was part of the discussion during the bill's creation was, well, we don't want to, make it stand out that this person, hey, they're undocumented or whatever. Okay, I think that's a rational concern you have, but other states seem to do it. Other states seem to accomplish the goal of the safer roads, the insured drivers, folks being able to get to work and contribute in the economy. Now, these are all the arguments we heard for the DPCs. And now it does appear that, yeah, in fact, those could potentially be used to vote. If they register, they can potentially vote. That's concerning. We're still doing research on all of the intricacies of the stages and what's behind the barcode. If there is a legislative solution, you can guarantee it'll be put forward next year in abundance. And if possible, we have to correct that because, again, that goes right back to the very first thing we spoke about. We're undercutting people's confidence in the process, and when you do that, you absolutely dilute the integrity of the process.
I'm told we have about a minute left, surprisingly, but let me ask you over a general question. Are there any of the bills that passed that your caucus opposed, or any that should have been passed that didn't?
Oh, sure. There were a lot of bills that we opposed. There was a lot of work towards addressing the affordable housing issue. And there's no question that there is a housing issue in the state, but the Republicans are very strongly in favor of local control and remaining or maintaining that local control where towns can decide the character of their town, what goes where, business goes here, housing goes there, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of the bills this year took that away, took that control away. There were, I think, a total of 12 bills that passed this year that seriously undercut towns' ability to control how the town is developed. And I think that that's extremely dangerous, particularly in rural districts like the one that I represent, where we have farming interests. We're in the Situate water supply, reservoir water supply, watershed rather, and we have septic systems and wells, all which can be polluted if building is too dense. And I mean, there are a lot of concerns that we felt just weren't taken seriously, and we did vehemently oppose a lot of those initiatives.
Well, we're out of time, and I want to thank Minority Leader Mike Chippendale for coming on the program. We could have probably talked for another half hour. And I want to invite you to come back again in the next session, and we'll see what's going on at that time. And I want to thank the audience, the State of the State, for tuning in to this edition of the program. Thank you.